Hello, today we're talking about something, in my opinion, quite fun and interesting, and it will lead to some fun discussions when we meet up in class together. But we're going to look into genetic diseases and pedigree charts. So here are your key terms and objectives. And we're going to start off with some important key terms. So I've already mentioned this term in the past, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it now. So we have autosomes and sex chromosomes. Chromosomes number 1 through 22, or pairs 1 through 22. Those are our autosomes. These are our non-sex chromosomes. And then chromosome pair 23 is the X's or Y's, or XY, excuse me. So those, while they have other information on them, they also determine the biological sex of the organism. So when we talk about an autosomal disorder or an autosomal trait, we're talking about one that's affected by the or that is on the autosome, not on our sex chromosome. So it's on chromosomes pairs 1 through 22, not on the X, not on the Y. And the ones that we're going to talk about for this class at least, which we're going to get into in person, they're going to follow Mendel's dominance. And so we have autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive disorders, meaning one is linked to the dominant trait, one is linked to the recessive trait. So an autosomal dominant disorder is one where anyone that has the dominant allele has the disease. So you either have it or you don't. Because if you are homozygous dominant, you have it. If you are heterozygous, because you even have one dominant allele, you have the trait, or in this case, the disease. And then if you have only recessive alleles, you do not have the trait or the disease. I say disease in this case primarily because in class we're going to focus on more problems that and disorders that arise from these rather than actual traits, but anything that's autosomal dominant in its inheritance pattern can just be a trait as well, not necessarily something that's harmful. It can just be a characteristic of the organism. So in this case, there's no carriers, which we'll get into in a moment, but carriers are basically people who appear unaffected but have the ability to pass it on. With autosomal dominant, you either have the trait or the disease or you don't have it. There's no carrying capacity here. An autosomal recessive disorder is one that's linked to the recessive allele, the lowercase letter. So in this case, you need 2 copies in order for the disease or the trait to show up. Just how we kind of talked about with blue eyes, you need 2 copies of the blue eye allele in order for it to show up in the organism, for the phenotype to show. So in this case, if you are homozygous dominant, you do not have the trait or disease. If you are heterozygous, you're called a carrier. This is someone who does not have the disease or the disorder, someone who is outwardly, quote unquote, normal, but you can still pass it on. So this would be like 2 brown-eyed parents having a blue-eyed child. They have the capacity to pass on that trait or that disease. Now, when you have a homozygous recessive genotype, you will have that trait or that disease. Now, the next type of trait or disorder that we're going to look at are the sex-linked disorders. So these are ones that are going to affect your sex chromosomes, your X or your Y. These, while they determine our sex, also have non-sex related genes on them. However, the pattern in which we inherit these is going to be somewhat sex dependent because of the fact simply that these particular chromosomes help determine biological sex. So with these, we look at traits that are X-linked or Y-linked. And X-linked traits actually affect more males than females because of the fact that males only inherit one X chromosome. So if you happen to inherit one that has the trait or the disorder or the disease, there's no second copy that could potentially give you a non-disordered trait for it to overpower. So in this case, females will often have, more of a chance of that disordered copy being inactivated or hidden by a more dominant, healthy copy. If a male gets a damaged copy of the X, unfortunately, they don't have another X to compensate. So males will show X-linked disorders far more often than females because females can be carriers of them. And remember that you cannot live without at least one X chromosome. There are also Y-linked disorders, and only males can get these, obviously, because the Y chromosome defines male characterization. So in this case, anything that has to do with a disorder on the Y chromosome or a faulty allele on the Y chromosome is considered Y-linked. So there's no carriers here because you either have a Y or you don't, similar with males with the X-linked disorders. And in this case, if a father is affected by a Y-linked disorder, every single one of his sons will have the disorder as well, or the trait, because in order for the father to have sons at all, he has to give that Y chromosome. Girls get one X from their dad and one of the two X's from their mom. Male sons have to get the one X from one of their mom's X's, but their dad has to give them the Y for them to be male. So in this case, if you see a trait where a dad has it, all of his sons will have it as well. Only if it's Y-linked, though. If it's X-linked or autosomal, then that is not the case. And so we can track diseases and traits through family lines, through generations, using something called a pedigree. So this is a chart that's similar to a family tree, except rather than just tracking descendants, it's particularly showing us a trait or a disorder that we're tracking through that family line. So we can use this to determine, is this trait autosomal? Is it sex-linked? Is it dominant? Is it recessive? And we do this by looking at specific characterizations that match the trait description. So first, let's talk about what a pedigree looks like. Females are represented by circles, males are represented by squares. So you can see here we have a female with a line attaching her to a male. And this has a Roman numeral 1 on the side. So this is indicating generation 1, like the P generation that we talked about with Mendel. Now, a horizontal line is considered a marriage line or a union line in the sense that these two organisms mated and are going to have offspring together. So in this case, that causes a vertical line, which is a line of descent, showing that these two organisms have two offspring together. And see, while this is a horizontal line, it's a bracketed horizontal line. It does not directly connect those two shapes to the shape itself. It's connecting it to the line that is associated with the parents. And also we can see that this is the next generation by the Roman numeral switching to 2. So these are the siblings, and there can be many different ways that siblings show up. You can have them with a normal bracket, and you can have as many attached to that bracket as you need based on how many children that pairing has. You can have a bisected line for twins. You can have adopted children, but then obviously that wouldn't work necessarily for genetics if we're looking at a trait because they have their own sets of genetics. And then they can also show miscarriages as well, which may partially be important if we're looking at a trait that might cause miscarriage. But overall, that's the basic structure here. And if any of these siblings were to have their own pairing, they would have a horizontal line connecting them to their spouse or mate, and then they would have a line drop down for the third generation with their offspring. So that's the basic structure of them. Now, when we talk about tracking a trait or a disorder, we now start to fill in the shapes. So often if a shape is filled in, whether it's a circle or a square, that is saying that this person is affected with the trait or the disease or the disorder. If they are partially filled in halfway, this indicates a carrier, someone who appears normal but has the capacity to pass on that trait. Now, often pedigrees may not have that carrier on there, especially if it's for a classroom setting, because often the instructor wants you to identify who the carriers might be on a pedigree. But just know that anything filled in is someone either affected with the trait, if it's fully filled in, or if it's partially, then they are a carrier. So we have two example pedigrees here. We have generation 1 here, generation 2, 3, and 4 generations on the left. We have partially filled in symbols, so we do have carriers here. And if I were to ask you to tell me, is this an autosomal disorder or is this a sex-linked disorder? And then is it dominant or is it recessive? How would we be able to identify that? Well, first, this one gives you a really dead-on giveaway in that there are carriers. If this was a dominant trait, then there would be no carriers because remember, either you have it or you don't have it if it's a dominant trait. So anytime carriers appear at all, automatically you know this is a recessive trait. But is it autosomal or sex-linked? How can we really tell the difference? Well, if it's Y-linked, then any father who has it would give it to all of his sons, and there wouldn't be any carriers. If it's X-linked, then you would see more males affected than females. So that's one thing that we can do very quickly is scan this whole chart. I see 2 females fully affected and 3 females that are carriers, while I only see carrier males. So in this case, it's probably not going to be sex-linked, because if it was X-linked, then more males would be affected than females, and that's just not what we're seeing in this case. Especially in the case of this mom here, if this was X-linked, then both of these sons would have the trait. They would not be carriers, they would be full expressing of that trait. So this is going to be autosomal recessive. Why? Because there are carriers and we see it skipping generations. So this mom has it, none of her children have it, but her grandchild does. And then there's an equal number of males to females affected, or at the very least, there's not more males affected than females. Now let's look at this one on the right here. Immediately, something is sticking out to me. First, there are carriers, so this is going to be another recessive. But is it autosomal or sex-linked? Well, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 males that are fully affected by the trait or the disease, and I don't see any carrier males. I'm only seeing carrier females. Now, yeah, I do see 1 fully affected female, but she's the only one. So this is a dead giveaway that this is an X-linked disorder. More males affected than females, significantly more carrier females than affected females, and there are no carrier males. So this is an X-linked recessive pedigree. So why? There are carriers, it skips generations. The affected sons are from carrier mothers, and there are more males than females that are fully affected. So that is it for this particular one. I want to save our discussion of the actual diseases and disorders for in person, where we can have deeper discussion and ask questions. And I have a really cool pedigree that I want to show you as well that kind of gets into some fun history and some scandals in history. So this will end our topic of genetics, and we're going to get into our last topic of the semester, which is evolution. See you all later.